the elimination of any discriminatory and artificial obstacles from the world energy markets, and proposed to finally open a free and honest dialogue between energy suppliers and its consumers. Let's see what the reaction will be to this. On food, once again, as the President has repeatedly said, they showed the capabilities of the Russian Federation in ensuring the stability of world grain markets, primarily wheat, as well as world fertilizer markets, showed the obstacles that still remain on this path. Contrary to the agreement reached within the framework of the Secretary-General's package initiative, that the UNIT will be engaged in removing obstacles to the export of our fertilizers and grain. Nevertheless, despite all these difficulties and sanctions restrictions, we have already exported 10.5 tons of grain, mainly about 8 million tons of wheat, 60% to Asia, and about 40% to African countries. And finally, on health, they spoke in favor of intensifying international cooperation to increase preparedness for infectious diseases, including those similar to the coronavirus pandemic, supported the efforts of the World Health Organization as the main international structures to coordinate the response of the world community to these challenges in the field of health, in the field of threats to the world's population, supported the idea of creating between the World Health Organization and the World Bank Fund, which should specifically address the needs of developing countries in this area. We also talked about the need to implement existing solutions, that vaccination should be a public domain. We have given examples that characterize the discrepancy between the real picture and the stated goals, in particular, due to the gap in vaccination levels, due to the gap in approaches to vaccination. Its level in developed countries was 60%, and in developing countries about 5%. In the poorest countries, about 5%. Another of our proposals was to abandon the monopolization of pharmaceutical markets. We recalled that the Russian vaccine Sputnik V was the first vaccine developed, and despite the fact that its registration was artificially slowed down, both through the World Health Organization and the European Commission, it proved its effectiveness by more than 95% and was successfully delivered to 70 states. And the last topic that sounded in the context of healthcare, we touched upon the problem of biological security, primarily in the context of the military biological activity that the United States, under Pentagon programs, deployed in dozens of countries in all regions of the world, especially in Eurasia, along the perimeter of the borders of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, and noted that our attempts to figure out what these military biologists are doing there are encountering resistance both within the framework of the Convention on the Prohibition of Biological Weapons and within the framework of the UN Security Council, where we recently raised this issue. But we will continue to strive for the creation of an effective, transparent monitoring mechanism for such programs. Well, there were a lot of short conversations with participants from various countries on the sidelines. I can tell you about it in more detail later, if it's interesting. Please tell me if it was finally possible to sign the General Convention discussed at the G20 summit and agree on all the points. Is there any mention of Ukraine in this document, and acceptable for the wording of this document? But you probably don't mean the convention, but the final declaration. Yes, the work on it is almost complete. This document will be approved following the results of tomorrow's meeting, at which the topic of digitalization will be considered. Anton Siluanov, the finance minister, will participate on our behalf. The declaration in question covers all areas that were discussed: food, energy, healthcare, and digitalization. Yes, our Western colleagues tried in every possible way. To make this declaration politicized, they tried to drag through formulations that would imply condemnation of the actions of the Russian Federation on behalf of the entire 20, that is, including ourselves. We insisted that if we really want to touch on this topic, although it does not concern the agenda and competence of the G20 in any way, then let's act honestly, and let's fix that we have differences on this topic. Yes, there is a war going on in Ukraine, a hybrid war that the West has unleashed, and which it has been preparing for many years, starting from the moment when it supported the openly Russian neo-Nazi forces coming to power as a result of a coup d'état. Since then, NATO has been actively developing the territory of Ukraine, conducting exercises, supplying weapons. Well, you know how events unfolded further, including the sabotage of the Minsk agreements, including the beginning of preparations for a military operation against Donbass. Therefore, where the draft declaration refers to the fact that an exchange of views on these issues took place, the parties confirmed their positions, which were stated repeatedly in the United Nations, including in the Security Council, and in the General Assembly, in particular, when the last General Assembly resolution was adopted, which was voted on. It was unanimous, and it was clearly confirmed that everyone had their own assessments, which were set out there. The West added the phrase that we, many delegations, condemned Russia. We wrote down that alternative points of view were also stated. We believe that this is quite enough because it is not at all the business of the Group of 20 to get deeply involved in this topic. Here it is necessary to deal with specific issues to bring the Kiev regime back to normal, so that it stops promoting Russophobic Russian policy. In my speech, I asked what our Western colleagues would do, for example, if Belgium banned French in the same way as Ukraine banned Russian, in all spheres without exception. Or what would the UK do if Ireland banned the English language? There were no answers, as you understand. But I believe that if the West was so obsessed with its idea, and probably tried to use this approach to disrupt the G20, disrupt the adoption of the declaration, and then blame us for this, then it failed. Hello? Thank you. Ivan Prozorov, Channel 1. Continuing the topic, did the United States eventually manage to turn the G20 summit into such an anti-Russian exclusive platform, replacing the global agenda of the summit? And what we were just talking about, behind closed doors during these short meetings, were the voices of the countries that came, well, really to discuss important issues and problems. You know, well, all the main work on the important issues that are on the agenda of the G20. It took place in recent days, at the expert level, at the ministerial level. And this work is reflected, its results are reflected in the substantive parts of the declaration. As for the Ukrainian topic, both the United States and all of its allies are in the discussions. Colleagues, this is about how the G20 agenda is approaching now. Sergey Viktorovich, in continuation of this question, we always say that we are supported by those countries of the population that make up about 3/4 of the planet, and support, among other things, the positions on building a multipolar world that Vladimir Putin voiced during the Valdai Forum. It's clear that it's probably difficult to deal with transnational corporations in economic terms, right? That's less of a global world, so to speak. As the military supports, we can see in the framework of joint exercises, as it happens with diplomats, that they manage to get on the plane. Big one. The West makes it a priority to throw the Ukrainian plot into any discussions. The third world countries are calling for a peaceful settlement, calling for an early agreement. They know perfectly well that Ukraine is slowing down this process, which, among other things, legally banned negotiations with the Russian Federation by Zelensky's decree. Therefore, this question is not for us. That's exactly what I said today during my short conversations with President Macron and with Chancellor Scholz. Novella Russia 1. Did you have a meeting with Guterres? Did he discuss the future of the grain deal with the Secretary General there? It expires in a few days. And on what terms is Russia ready to renew the grain export agreement? The conditions are very simple. They are all written down in the original agreement, which had 2 parts, and both parts were approved in the package. The first export of Ukrainian grain is carried out after the Ukrainian armed forces used the humanitarian corridor to export grain for military purposes. We suspended the implementation of this operation, but then the Ukrainians confirmed that they would not do so again. Our Turkish colleagues and Western colleagues have an understanding that they must restrain Ukraine from such unacceptable actions. The second part of the deal was the removal of obstacles to the export of Russian grain. And here we must pay tribute to the Secretariat, the Secretary General. They are trying their best, but 5 months have passed, while practical results, by and large, have not been achieved. But today, at the meeting, the Secretary General talked about the promises that the United States and the European Union gave him, including on paper. They set out, I would say, good intentions. If they are implemented, then the obstacles to the export of our fertilizers and grain will be removed, but it's not about the papers, but how they will be implemented in practice. We are assured through the mouth of the Secretary General, and he refers to his Western colleagues, that all economic operators involved in ensuring the supply chain of Russian fertilizers and grain receive signals reassuring them that they will not be subject to sanctions. Sanctions, if they cooperate on the implementation of trade deals with our grain, including the entry of Russian ships into European ports, including the entry of foreign ships into our ports, including ensuring the full operation of the Roselkhoznadzor, and, of course, ensuring normal insurance rates. Here are all the promises set out. I hope that they will be fulfilled. At least, the General Tsar has sworn today that this is a priority issue for him.
Maria, good evening. Sergey Viktorovich. First of all, I am glad to see you in good health here, not in some Indonesian hospital. As for their question, the Western partners, after all, there is a feeling that they have recently cancelled the rhetoric regarding relations with Russia. After all, we are beginning to hear words like peace, negotiations. Right now there are problems in the EU with the adoption of a new package of sanctions. What caused such changes and what can we expect?
You see, it's hard for me to judge. Someone else's soul is dark, and especially the soul of the European Union. The darkness is very thick there, if they sometimes dissipate. Then not for long. Therefore, as I have already said, today, I had a brief conversation with President Macron, who confirmed his intention to continue contacts with President Putin in order to find some agreements that will resolve the whole situation, as he put it. But I reminded you of what I just told you, that all the problems are on the Ukrainian side, which categorically refuses any negotiations and puts forward conditions that are obviously unrealistic and inadequate to this situation.
Good afternoon, Jackals, Sputnik News Agency. Yesterday, the European Union officially launched a training mission for the Russian military on its territory. This program provides for the training of 15,000 military personnel. How can this decision affect the further development of the Ukrainian crisis? And does the launch of this program finally make the European Union a direct participant in the conflict in Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, I believe that the European Union and NATO have long been hybrid participants in a hybrid conflict, a hybrid war in Ukraine. This includes the supply of weapons, training of military personnel, assistance in providing a huge amount of intelligence, participation in determining goals. As you know, the Americans are doing this work of instructors on the ground, not to mention thousands of mercenaries. As for the specific decision of the European Union to launch this military training mission, there is a kind of split of consciousness. Because in parallel with this, as I have already said, both President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, and other European leaders are talking about the need to move to a peaceful settlement. Political, as I have already said, a split personality or, as President Putin said, specific non-traditional forms of international relations. But we get used to it, everything happens.
A star.
Sergey Viktorovich, good afternoon. The TV channel Zvezda, what Vishnov Konstantin. Please tell me, do you personally see signals from the West to Kiev about the resumption of peace talks with Ukraine, and in your opinion, what should happen for them to finally take place? Well, I can't go around in circles. We have repeatedly confirmed through the President's mouth that we are not giving up negotiations. And if anyone refuses, it's Ukraine. And the longer she refuses, the more difficult it will eventually be to negotiate. As for the signals to Zelensky from the West, we read various reports with reference to some anonymous sources. Rumors are circulating that the American administration seems to be telling Dvoryansky to be compliant. Then it is immediately clarified that this is not so that he really behaves constructively, but in order to remove objections from that part of the Western world that is beginning to doubt the need to supply him with additional weapons. From Zelensky's speech, which was very interesting today at the meeting, the chairman of the G20 decided to let him speak. The speech was recorded. It lasted 20 minutes, although each participant was given about 3 minutes. So that everyone had time to speak. Zelensky spoke for 20 minutes. It was impossible to interrupt him, because it was a recording. Apparently, they didn't want to turn off the recording, but I made only one conclusion from his speech, that he doesn't listen to any Western advice yet. Well, I won't list everything he said. There was militant rhetoric, Russophobic, aggressive, but the content of this speech and the condition of this person is best characterized by his phrase, not very screwed up, but pronounced. He said that the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944 was a turning point in the Second World War. Draw your own conclusions.
The final question, please, TASS. Sergey Petrovich, in Ukraine, TASS agency. We also partially answered my question. But I would like to add, today, the newspaper Politica reported that GAD is preparing the ground for possible negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, with the appearance of winter cold. Some contacts are being worked out in practical terms, perhaps with Washington.
Please.
And yesterday, you had a telephone conversation at every step, but no details were given from either side. Could you tell us what it was about? And is your face-to-face contact with STEP being prepared?
As for the message that the Americans are allegedly preparing some kind of negotiations there, these rumors constantly pop up and also disappear with the same success later. We don't react to it anymore. We want to see concrete evidence that the West is seriously interested in disciplining Zelensky and explaining to him that this cannot continue, that it is not in the interests of the Ukrainian people and himself. Regarding the conversation with Shaglu, we discussed the preparation of the final declaration of the G20, including the section devoted to the grain deal. And as for the exact contact with him, we are not planning it, because it only took place today. Thank you. Thank you.